welcome back everybody to World of Tanks Xbox 360 edition. My name as always is Maxwell, and today I thought I'd just go through a very brief overview of the Russian tanks before we get into any actual gameplay. So, without further ado, what I'm going to do is just give you a general overview of the different lines, the different tanks, and then maybe a little bit of specifics for certain tanks of note within the lines. So, first off, we can just ignore the tier 1, it's a tier 1. So the first 4 tiers here, 1 to 4. These, well, obviously you've got the tank destroyers across the top. The BT and A20, they lead into the mediums. And the T26, T46, T28, they lead into the heavies. So characteristics of the BT line is, first and foremost, it's incredibly fast, but incredibly terrible on the turns, especially with the A20. It's absolutely fantastic in a straight line, got great agility and acceleration, but when you try to turn with the thing, you can pretty much lose up to 50% of your speed right away. Heading to the... Whoops, don't know what I've done there. Heading to the bottom line, the T26, T46, and T28. A little bit slower, a little less maneuverable, a little bit more heavily armed. As you can see, though, the T46 branches off from the T50, which is the dedicated Tier 4 scout for the Russians. This thing, pretty good, pretty fast, doesn't lose all of its speed on the turn like the A20, a little bit better armed, but not as fast in a straight line. T28, a pretty unremarkable tank. It's not until you get past tier 5 that the tanks start distinguishing themselves. Same with the tank destroyer line. The tank destroyer line with the Russians, lower on, the thing that characterizes them is they've got pretty good guns, but they've got very, very weak armor to begin with. So, on to the tier 5 tanks where they start to differentiate themselves. At tier 5, you've got a choice of either the T34 or the KV-1. T34 being a standard tier 5 medium tank. Nothing particularly special. It's got well, it doesn't have half-decent armor. It's got pretty poor armor. Got a decent amount of speed, but like the A20, suffers from the losing a lot of it during the turn and gets a pretty nice choice of weapons. KV-1 is very, very heavily armoured, even more so than the T1 Heavy. So this thing, when you angle it correctly, can be very, very difficult to hurt. Doesn't get a great selection of guns. I think it only gets a choice of a 57mm and a derp cannon. So, not very versatile for dishing out the damage, but very, very tough and very, very difficult to penetrate. One thing I would say is, when you're making your decision of whether to go down the medium line or the heavy line for the Russians, the question you want to ask yourself is, how far up the tree do you want to go? If you want to go tier 5, 6, and 7, go heavies. If you want to get to tier 9 and 10, I would recommend go mediums. And we're going to get onto the reasons for that right now. So straight away we look at tier 6, the T3485, not a very remarkable tank again. Okay speed, okay survivability, okay weaponry. It's just a very, very average tank. SU-100, great tank destroyer, gets a fantastic cannon, but it's not very maneuverable and doesn't have a fantastic camo rating. With this thing, you really need to get in a bush, stop, set up, make your aim, and then try and wreak havoc after that. Before that, you can't really, it's not a really fire on the move or an assault kind of tank destroyer. Then we come to the KV-1S, the legendary KV-1S. If you don't know what this tank is capable of, just Google it or type KV-1S on my channel and you'll see a couple of replays from that tank. It is absolutely crazy. Reason for that is, we will take a very quick look at the packages. The reason for its craziness is this package right here. If you buy this package right here, you get this cannon, the 122mm D25T, which has 175mm of penetration and 390 average damage. Yes, you read that right. 390 average damage at tier 6 on a heavy tank. It is a little bit crazy. The thing I always say about the KV-1S is it plays a lot more like a tier 8 medium than it does a tier 6 heavy. It's got good speed, decent top speed, okay traverse. Its armor's not fantastic, which is why you liken it more to a medium tank, but the armament on it is ridiculous. The only downside to this gun, as you can see, the rate of fire is 3.75 per minute, which means you're going to have about a 12 to 14 second reload, depending on what equipment and crew skills you have. But then again, when you get up to higher tiers, that's going to be an average reload anyway, so this just kind of gets you used to it earlier in the game. But if you're used to coming from tanks which fire every 4 or every 6 seconds, this thing can take a little bit of getting used to. Like I said, you're going to fire every 12 to 14 seconds with this thing. So, really punishing reload when you're not used to it, but with the amount of damage it's able to kick out, this thing is absolutely crazy. Which is why I'm saying, if you only intend to get to tier 5 or 6, go with the heavy line and go with the KV-1S for that very reason. Because when you come onto the IS as well, as you can see here, uses the same gun, 122mm D25, actually got a faster reload speed, and it's the same for the SU-100. It uses the 122mm, you guessed it, D25S with an even faster reload. So pretty much all of the Soviet big tanks are going to use this gun pretty much all the way up to tier 8. So coming onto the IS, it's basically just the KV-1S's big brother. More hit points, a little bit slower, much more heavily armoured than the KV-1S is. Able to survive a little bit of a beating, got a much better hit point pool, and as you can see, still has that 120mm D whatever. The suffix you want to put after that. Same cannon though. Next we come to the T-43. Again, pretty average medium tank. It's not fantastic. The only good side for this tank is people tend to underestimate it, and you can sometimes come up big and surprise them. But apart from that, as you can see, it only uses an 85mm cannon, so you're not going to do fantastic amounts of damage, but it does have a good reload and decent penetration. But at tier 7, very, very unremarkable tank. At tier 7 tank destroyer, you've got the SU-152. Again, not a massive shining star in any particular category. We have a look at the top cannon it can mount. Again, 122mm. Surprise, surprise. It does have a better reload speed, though. You can see it fires 6.67 rounds per minute. Next, we come on to tier 8. Tier 8 heavy is the IS-3, arguably tier for tier one of the best tanks in the game. It's got fantastic piked armor at the front, meaning you can sit flush on with someone and bounce shots pretty much all day. Decent hit point pool, 1,450. I think with the upgraded turret, at least on the PC version, it gets a bit more health than that. Gets 1,500 if I'm not mistaken. If we take a look at the modules it's able to load, surprise, surprise, 122mm, but this one is the BL9, so it's even bigger, 225mm of penetration, but the same alpha damage. Coming on to the T-44, this is when the medium tanks start to get decent. T-44 is an okay tank, doesn't have fantastic armor on paper, as you can see, only 90mm there. But it is nicely sloped at the front, so if you angle correctly, you have a good chance of bouncing shots. Again, though, cannon is a little bit lackluster on this one. It's a 100mm D10T, 175mm of penetration, 230 hit points of damage. Then we come on to the tank destroyers, tier 8, the ISU-152. This thing is a bit of a beast for tier 8. You can see it doesn't have fantastic hit point pool, has okay armor, so this thing again, you want to sit at the back, you want to camp as hard as possible in as many bushes as possible. But the good thing about this vehicle is that 152mm BL10. That cannon is crazy. 286mm of penetration. Yep, again, you read that correctly. 286mm of penetration, 750 points of alpha damage at tier 8. This thing is an absolute troll cannon. It will wreck people's days. Problem with it again though is the long reload time, 3.41 rounds per minute. And the accuracy can be a little bit troll sometimes. On paper it might be half decent, but in practice you do tend to miss a few shots. So firing at long range, not really advised with this thing. You want to get to medium range. But then again, if you're at medium range, you're more than likely going to get yourself taken out. So a little bit of a catch-22 with this thing. Luckily though, you've got a cannon which is able just to punch people's faces cleanly off. Coming to tier 9, This is where the heavy line starts to falter. Coming up from the IS-3, you're used to having a decent amount of armor. You come into the IS-8, and all of the armor just disappears. Okay, hit point pool at 1700. Hull armor might be on paper 120. We take a quick look at the IS, as it's only 110. But the IS-8 still has that piked front, but for some reason its armor just feels a lot weaker. Now, I'm not just saying it feels a lot weaker. In practice, it is a lot weaker. It gets penned a hell of a lot more than the IS-3 does. Doesn't tend to bounce as many shots as the IS-3 either. The only saving grace that this tank has is it does come equipped with a good top cannon. The 122mm M62T2. You can see that one is a tier 10 gun, so for a heavy tank, fantastic. 258 mils of penetration, 440 alpha damage, and like I said, that is a tier 10 gun. So only saving grace this tank has. Thing with the IS-8 is it plays a lot more like a medium tank than it does a heavy tank. So if you were expecting to get even more heavily armoured tanks as they go up the line, unfortunately, you're going to be in for a little bit of a disappointment with the IS-8. It takes a completely different set of skills to play this one properly, which is why I'm saying if you only want to stick around tier 5, 6, and 7, go for the heavies. If you want to get to tier 9 and 10, go for the mediums, and this is the reason, the T-54 medium tank. Arguably the best tank in the whole of World of Tanks tier for tier, and I'm not even exaggerating on that point. T-54, strongest tank. Gets a good hit point pool, 1600 with the upgraded turret. On paper, again, its hull armor only 120, but the fantastic sloping of that armor means that when you angle it properly, you are going to bounce a hell of a lot of shots. If you're able to get this thing hull down, it's even stronger with 200 points of turret armor, and the commander's hatches on the top of this thing are tiny and very, very difficult to hit. Problem with getting hull down with this tank is it has terrible, terrible gun depression, but then again, all Russian tanks at high tiers have terrible gun depression, so you just need to get used to it and overcome it. If we take a look at the packages for this tank, problem it has is a lackluster cannon on both fronts. If we take a look at the details, you've got this one here, the 100mm D54, gets decent rate of fire at 7.32, 219 penetration and 320 alpha damage, but if you have a look at the aiming time, it's 2.9 with a 0.38 accuracy. If we have a look at the other cannon, it's got the same sort of rate of fire, lower penetration at 201mm, damage the same at 320, but a much better aiming time and a much better accuracy. I would always recommend going for this cannon, even though it has smaller amount of penetration, because of that aiming time and because of that accuracy. When you're a medium tank and on the move, you are going to need it. Now, the only problem with this is on the 360 version, it is an offshoot. So, on the PC version, this leads to the Object, whereas this cannon leads to the T62A, and because the only tank in at the moment is the T62A, you're going to have to make a massive, massive detour to get this cannon here. As you can see, it's 133,000 XP to get it. So what I would probably recommend is unlock the T62A first, then come back and get the cannon, if that's something that you're going to want to do. Because trust me, once you've played the T-54 for a while, you are not going to want to sell this thing. Like I said, tier for tier, best tank in World of Tanks. Then we come on to the Object 704. Finally, the tank destroyers for the Russians get some armor and get some survivability in the form of the Object 704. Again, good hit point pool at 1600. Front armor 120. Fantastic, actually. Again, on paper, doesn't seem particularly thick, especially compared to some of the Russian counterparts, but this thing is ridiculously bouncy. It's the one thing that characterizes the high-tiered Russians, is on paper their armor might not be as good as some of the German counterparts, but the sloping and the angles on it mean that people bounce a hell of a lot more than they do on other tanks. Taking a look at the guns that it is able to equip, you see its top cannon, 152mm BL-10, the exact same cannon that the ISU-152 equips, 286 pen, 750 damage, so as you can see, that cannon is totally OP for tier 8. Finally, coming on to tier 10, IS-7, good all-round heavy tank. Personally, I would have preferred the IS-4 in over the IS-7, as the IS-4 is a lot tougher, a lot more hit points and tends to bounce a lot more, but the IS-7 is still a pretty good tank. pretty low on the hit point pool at 2150. Pretty good engine power and half decent armor. You can see 150 front and 150 sides. But because it's got that piked front, you have to be aware that you don't want to angle yourself too much against your opponent, or else that will just, they're going to penetrate right through your armor. And the other problem is it has sort of a peak at the front, which exposes quite a significant chunk of your lower plate to enemy tanks. So you've got to be careful with that one. Try and keep your lower plate hidden. Try and keep your tank flat on. Plus side for this thing is it has fantastic turret armor of 240 and sloped very, very nicely. Even on the side, it's 185. Cannon on this thing, again, not fantastically good. 130mm S70. If we can get some stats on it, well, it looks like the stats are rolled into the tank. Penetration 188 to 313, damage 358 to 513. So cannon's pretty damn good, but is it the same cannon that the IS-8 gets? We will double check. No, the IS-8 gets a 122mm. So IS-7 gets a slightly better cannon. When it comes to T-62A, this thing is probably one of the second best tanks in the game. If we take a look at its stats, pretty good hit point pool, just under 2,000. Fantastic armor. Again, it only says 102, but on paper it doesn't really matter. It does tend to bounce a lot of shots. Turret armor very, very strong. Weak spots very, very small. And it gets a fantastic rate of fire. It gets about a 6.5 second reload speed. When you put a rammer on there, get your crew up to 100%, you can get that down to about 6 seconds. 5.8 seconds. And trust me, with the alpha damage that this thing kicks out, yes, it's only 248 minimum, 400 at maximum. But with the penetration of the gun and the sheer volume of shots you're going to be firing, this thing is an absolute demon. So like I said, if you're wanting to get to top tier, go for the mediums rather than the heavies. You just have to try and slog through the tier 5 to tier 7 quagmire that it is. Tier 5, 6, and 7 for the mediums, not fantastically good. And finally on to the Object 268 tier 10 tank destroyer. Again, a little bit below average hit points. Very, very good front armor. The only problem with this is, again, because it's got a piked front, you want to stay flat on with your enemy. Problem, again, has the IS-7 problem that it does have a little peaked nose at the front that people are going to have an easier time penetrating. But as you can see, fantastic cannon on it. Average damage between 638 and 1063. In fact, let's take a quick look. It is the 152mm M64. So not quite the same, not the BL10, but all that means is it has a slightly faster reload time. The penetration is exactly the same, and the alpha damage is exactly the same. So you can see the Russians get that gun at tier 8 and use it all the way through to tier 10. And the same with the KV-1S, gets that 122mm, and they use it all the way through to the IS-3. So that's going to be it for my very, very brief overview of the Russian tanks newly added to World of Tanks Xbox 360 edition. If you've got any very specific questions about the Russian tanks, stick a comment in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer as many of those as I humanly can. And hopefully in the next day or so, maybe during the weekend or just after, I'll bring you a few videos from some of these beautiful Russian tanks. Personally, I'm going to be going to the KV-1S and the T-54, and that's going to be about it. I'm not really going to push too much down the heavy line. I'll be happy with the KV-1S, but I am going to push down the medium line and go for that T-54. So thanks very much for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something and found it informative. If you did, then please consider hitting that subscribe button, because there's a lot more World of Tanks content on this channel and a lot more to come in the future. I have been Maxwell. This has been my look at the Russian tanks added to World of Tanks Xbox 360 edition, and I will catch you guys next time.